Frank, thank you so much. I'll apologize ahead of time for my cold. COVID free. I got my test, but I've heard it's not transmitted digitally anyway. So hopefully my voice will last for the next 45 minutes. Listen, for those that don't know me, I cut my teeth in professional baseball working with, here's number three, the Pittsburgh Pirates. So for me, it's an absolute honor to be able to share some insights, obviously not only with those of you working in professional ball, but as was said earlier by Matt, those around the world who are able to tune in. Again, Frank, I loved how you said hunt the good. And I think you did a brilliant job of outlining all the good that can come from this platform and obviously this great event. So without further ado, we don't have a lot of time, but it's a pretty big topic I'm going to be sharing with you today. So I want to get right in to the high points. Again, Frank, you said we want information that people can execute on right away. My hope in the way I designed this is that's exactly what this presentation, this conversation will help you do. So as the title suggests, the language of coaching, the art and science of teaching movement. We are going to deep dive into language, the words you use to guide your athlete's focus, with the hopes that the way you guide their focus ultimately leads not only to better performance right now, but better learning in the future. And let me be very clear, I'm going to use the word coach throughout this presentation. But broadly speaking, when I say the word coach, I'm talking about movement professionals. So whether that's a physical therapist, a strength and conditioning coach, a personal trainer, a sport coach, whoever you are, if part of your job is communicating movement, as Daniel Coyle once put it to me, being a communication athlete, then everything that I'll be talking about today is relevant to you. Now, what I find as a challenge, let me open with a challenge around giving this presentation. Many of us are familiar with the what of what we do: program design, periodization, drill selection, exercise, sets and reps. But within our industry, from a development perspective, we spend far less time looking at how we do things, how we, so to speak, get the information off the program and into the person. And that's why this conference in particular is so refreshing. I see that mine is one of 3 different talks on talking, on communication. And so finally, it's now getting the attention it deserves. But as we talk about this as an emerging concept that we're trying to put language to, it presents the challenge in that not only are you trying to learn the vocabulary, so to speak, around the language of coaching, the variables involved in the language of coaching. In a presentation like this, I'm also trying to help you realize how to use them within your coaching practice. But here's the brilliant thing. Here's the silver lining. The vast majority of what I'm going to share today are things I guarantee you are already doing. My objective is to help you develop a grammar, a vocabulary around the language of coaching, so that you can understand the variables involved in turning what you say into how they move. And in helping you develop that vocabulary for things you will already be familiar with, you move your success, the success of your interaction in making a positive change, from chance to choice. And that's the ultimate objective today, to get to the words that work on purpose, by design, removing luck from the scenario. So let's get stuck in. We're talking about movement. The first question then we should probably ask ourselves is, how do coaches actually influence movement? Well, when we think about this, we recognize that it's not this picture on the screen. We don't have strings attached to the athlete's body, yet we are very capable of influencing their movement in highly nuanced ways, whether it's the way they're squatting in the gym, the way they're stealing second base, the way they're swinging a bat. In all of these cases, we see day in, day out, we have a capacity to influence movement, but not through direct contact, not through direct means. So what do? Well, ultimately, we are influencing, interacting with a person. We are doing something with this space between ourselves and others that somehow transforms the way they move. We do something with this program on paper. We convert it into a raw material the athlete can use to move better. And that medium we use, albeit invisible, is communication. And so what is our communication communicating with? What are we actually changing in the athlete's mind, in the athlete's body, that leads to a change in movement for better or worse? Well, ultimately, it comes down to the A word, attention. Attention, as I like to say, is the currency of learning. Attention is the currency of consciousness, right? Attention is involved anytime you are aware of something. And for learning to take place, you must be aware of what you are learning. I can't, in my sport in rugby, learn to sidestep an oncoming defender that I do not see. In baseball, I can't learn to hit the pitch that I do not see. And so ultimately, our attention has to be pointed at the source of insight, the source of information that is meant to help me move better. Now, we have multiple ways of doing this. Communication is only one. Let me give a non-communication way that you influence attention. We see it all the time in the weight room, and a lot of this was popularized by Gray Cook. So we have someone squatting, and let's say they're shifting their body weight too far to the right, and we're not happy with it. Well, what do? We take some kind of a band, we put it around their hip. They're still allowed to squat away, but now we pull them. We pull them into the error. Sometimes we call it feeding the error. But what you are feeding the body is not just the tension from the band. No, you're feeding the body an increase in attention around where that band is operating. And so the second I become aware of that band pulling me, I'm able to do something about it. I can't change something that I'm not aware of. Now, I just want to illustrate to you how attention is a limited capacity resource. And because it's limited capacity, it is very easy for our athletes to pay attention to the wrong things or attempt to pay attention to too many things. And this is one of the primary reasons we have coaches, because our chief responsibility is to capture, keep, and direct attention. So I'm assuming right now that you're sitting, right? So for all of you that are sitting, I want you just to notice how the pressure of the seat feels under your hips. You know, if you're wearing a watch like I am, I want you to notice how the watch feels on your arm. Assuming we're wearing clothes, not that we have to now in today's medium, but assuming you are, notice how the clothes feel on your body. Now, in all of those cases, assuming this is not the most boring presentation ever delivered, you were not aware of those sensory signals until I asked you to consider them. And so what that shows us is there is far more that we can access, that we can pay attention to than we ever can in any given moment. And this is why, as coaches, what we are doing, are we ready? I'd write this one down. We are educating attention. We are educating attention. That is our chief mechanism to influence the way people perform and learn. And the better we are at educating attention, the better that athlete will be at reaching the heights that are available to them from a performance perspective. Now, I've already alluded and given a direct example that there are multiple ways to do this. And so there are two primary ways that we can do this. That's it. There are two ways that we influence attention, and both are always in play. Both are always present. But we as a coach can decide which one, if you would like volume, we want to turn up at any given moment. And so let me read this phrase here in its entirety, then explain it. Coaches can influence how the person focuses on the environment. And when we think about that, all movement is happening in a context. All movement is happening in an environment. And so I use environment in the broadest sense. Environment includes a dumbbell, a barbell, the ground, an opponent, a bat, a ball, a glove, so on and so forth. So coaches can influence how the person directly focuses on the environment or how the environment captures the person's focus. And I do this first part verbally, and I can do this second part non-verbally. So to influence how someone focuses on the environment, I use language. I use a coaching cue typically. and I ask them to focus on something in a renewed, unique way. Let's say I'm teaching sprinting. They're not getting enough push off the ground. I tell them, I need you to explosively push the ground away, or explosively push towards second, or gradually rise as you drive like a jet taking off. In all of these cases, my language, texture, and shape focus, allowing them to, if you would, put a new puzzle piece in the driver's seat, putting a new address in the GPS would be another way to think of it. But at the same time, I know I can use nonverbal, environmentally driven tactics to draw attention in. I already gave you one example. For that person who is kicking their hip too far to the right in the squat, I can use that band. I can feed the error. And with minimal verbal prompting, they will now become aware of that sensory signal and self-correct. Ultimately, though, what I want us to recognize, what we are tapping into, these information sources, these attentional tunnels we are drilling into, they are always in existence. They are always active, whether or not we are coaching. There is always a person perceiving, and there is always an environment being perceived. What we are trying to do when it comes to coaching is bring that relationship into harmony such that they optimize the way they move in the context of the environment they're moving in. Now, as I'm sure you know, we spend a lot of time talking about the nonverbal stuff we can do to influence movement, especially from an adaptation perspective in strength and conditioning. And so I will not be talking about constraints or drills or the environment. That's not to disrespect it or downgrade it, but rather to emphasize that we haven't talked enough about talking, and not just the good that can come from knowing how to communicate effectively, but also the bad that can come from inadequate or ineffective communication. And so the beauty is all of us are guilty for both the good stuff and the bad stuff. I think the greatest coaches inevitably find out when it comes to communicating how to have more of the good stuff permeating out of their mouth than the bad. My hope is I can help us all do that today. And so we now want to ask the question around our focus point: how does coaching language shape focus? I think it's probably quite intuitive to many of us, but let's drill into it to make no assumptions. Now, when I was writing the book, The Language of Coaching, I knew that I wanted to focus specifically on this idea of cueing, right? Because cues tend to be the last thing we say to a person before they move. They tend to be the things we want them to think about while they move. And because a cue ultimately resides in the mind of the mover, it is going to have the greatest impact, for better or for worse, on the way that movement is formed. But I quickly realized that there are more information sources that we use language to deliver to the athlete beyond just the cue. And ultimately, I would be doing our industry a disservice if I didn't look broadly on categorically the different ways we use communication in what I'm going to call the learning/coaching arena. So to understand what you see on your screen, which is called the coaching communication loop, I just want you to mentally drop yourself in to a teaching moment. It could be you in the weight room by a squat rack. It could be you out on the field working on change of direction and sprinting. Whatever it is, give yourself a visual of you coaching. Ideally, a visual in your memory bank that is actually something you've done in the past. And this is now going to be used, if you would, as a way to map, to signpost the different types of language you use when you coach. Now, hopefully, the visuals in the labels make this fairly intuitive. It's called the coaching communication loop because these segments that are collectively called the DDCDD make up a long loop and a short loop. And it's called a loop because our communication loops around these movement moments that I'm calling the do it part of the loop, okay? The long loop versus the short loop, there's only a small differentiation. The long loop is primarily going to be used with these extra 2 steps over here when you're teaching something for the first time. Whereas the short loop, cue it, do it, debrief it, cue it, do it, debrief it, the CDD, that is going to be used continuously when you are coaching movements over and over again. And so the reality is it's important to understand both, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So put yourself in that position where you're teaching something for the first time. What are we going to do in terms of step one when it comes to opening our mouth? After possibly a little bit of banter, some introductions if it's the beginning of a session, once we actually get to the level of the activity, the drill, the movement, first thing we're going to do is describe it, okay? Sometimes if you're looking for this in the literature, it's called instruction. So we describe the movement. For me, the description is doing three things. I would encourage you to write these three things down. The first thing the description is trying to do is to paint a bird's eye, coach's eye picture of the movement in the athlete's mind, right? So this way you might be giving them some kind of technical instruction. Hey, I want your body to be long here if we're talking sprinting. You're going to drive your knee forward. You're going to push your leg back, right? So you're trying to use basic anatomy, kinesiological, technical type language to describe what takes place in this movement. Some might use more, some might use less. Some might not use it at all, but that's typically one part of a description. Part number two is going to be safety. Let's say you're working on a deadlift or Olympic lift or a squat. There might be specific insights in how you want them to set up such that they're not going to hurt themselves and they put themselves in the best position to perform, right? So technical understanding, bird's eye view, what does this movement kind of look like? Okay, I know what that is. I can relate to that. Okay, here's how I set up for it. I'm not going to get injured. Got it. What's the third piece? The third piece is normally just what we're going to call psychological or motivational. You might want to encourage that, tell the athlete, hey, this is something that you've done before. Maybe not in the weight room, but you've done it on the field. And what we call that is psychological readying or enhancing their expectancies. Hey, people like you are able to do this. Right? So three things: technical, safety, and psychological. That all kind of goes in, maybe not in that order, to your description. Collectively, we're just going to call that knowledge of what to do. You are giving them literally with your words knowledge of what to do. Now, most of us recognize that the attention span of our athletes seems to be narrowing, or at least they don't like to focus on us for very long. And so normally our descriptions, we say as much as needed, no more, no less. But we always typically want to give them a demonstration. We know as humans, like other animals, we're very good at mirroring. Ever watch a child develop and they're mirroring mom and dad the second they come into this world? And so we give them a demonstration. So now they have some verbal stuff to anchor to and some visual stuff. But now I want to pause. Ask yourself this: is that then the last step? Should they just go into performing the movement? Some might say yes. And even I will say sometimes that's where I stop. I give them a description, demonstration, and then I see how they perform the movement on their own with no additional prompting. But I think over time we realize that, especially for that new athlete, that description and that demonstration, especially if we kind of get that googly-eyed look that's kind of saying, so what do you want me to do? We realize that we need to give them the Cliff Notes version. We need to give them that one punchy idea, the headlight in the dark, to guide how that movement is formed. And that's typically where the cue is born. Now, an interesting anecdote here is many of us use cues inside of our long descriptions. The problem, as we'll see later on in the presentation, is if the cue is inside of your longer description, you're basing them focusing on it by their memory and judgment that that's the most important thing. And so the reason I call the cue out as a separate step is to ensure we say the most important thing right before they do the most important thing, which is perform the movement. And so the cue is that brief phrase. It's that one idea that should guide how they move. Notice I use the word how they move. Step back for a moment. If the description and the demonstration is knowledge of what to do, is that the same kind of knowledge needed to know how to do it? Well, tell me if this anecdote resonates. Have you ever had an athlete say to you, Coach, I know what you want me to do? Or they might even say, I know what to do. I just don't know how to do it. I'm sure we're getting a lot of nodding here. And I know I've been on the receiving end of that phrase more times than I care to remember. And so what's going on there? It suggests to us that knowledge of what to do is not the same as knowing how to do it. 1 second. The challenges of a cold. And so what we're recognizing here is the language we use to deliver the intellectual ability to describe something isn't the same language necessarily that helps them physically enact it, physically do it. And that's what I'm going to demonstrate needs to go into the cue. Once I've given them the cue, then they do it. Then they perform the movement. And then finally, there is this debrief. So what's going on in the debrief? Well, the debrief conventionally is called feedback. And we could give an entire presentation just on feedback. For our purposes today, I look at the debrief as being very simple. One, it's athlete plus coach. Where I can, I want to collaborate with them, especially as they increase in age and expertise and have more knowledge of what they are doing. But what is that collaboration meant to generate? It's meant to generate the next best idea, which is to say the next best cue we want them focusing on, like an address in a GPS, to move better. And so that debrief generates one of three outcomes. Again, I would encourage you to write these down. And this is what I call the 3 R's. Number 1, did the debrief suggest to you that the cue worked such that, hey, I enjoyed it, felt better, and to you it looked better? If that's the case, first R, you reiterate the cue, right? The cue still has potency, it's working. Let's stick with it, okay? Let's say your discussion nets the following. You watch them move, they seem to move a little bit better, but they say to you, yeah, that just didn't feel right. Or maybe you even ask them, well, what did you focus on, right? And they give you some Frankenstein version of what you said. So obviously the cue wasn't really sticky, but you know you're on to a winner, meaning what you're cueing is what you need to be changing. And so instead of reiterating the cue, and I'll show you how to do this later, you refine the cue. Yeah, but third outcome, what can happen? Well, the movement was miserable. It made it worse. Or let's say you've been using the same cue for a long time and its shelf life, its potency seems to have gone down. They're struggling to focus on it because it's no longer novel. Well, in that step 3, you're not going to reiterate it. You're not going to refine it. You're going to retire the cue. And assuming you still want them to work on the same thing, you're going to generate a new cue, a new coat of paint, excuse me, so to speak, to replace it. And so that debrief ensures that there's a constant narrative, making sure that what is going on in the head is matching and supporting what is going on in the body. To do this, it requires you to pay attention with great detail to the individuals and groups of individuals you are working with. And you can then see from there, there's no reason to go back to the beginning. I go back to the cue, the do, the debrief. Now, I want to see one more thing on this slide, and this slide does require me to use the most words of any of them. And that is, you might be thinking, well, do I need to give a cue on every single repetition? It depends on the potency of the cue. If you give a cue and it's working, you might decide to allow them to do 2 or 3 more repetitions as long as visually what you're seeing is positive. In other cases, when you're still trying to track down, hunt down the right cue, you might have this debrief and go through it every single repetition. Depends on the skill that you are teaching. And so ultimately, that's where the art of coaching is going to come in, right? How often you have to give a cue. But to the degree that you are ever going to give a cue, this is the process I suggest you use to organize your language. Now, for the remainder of the time I have, we're going to focus on the cue. We're going to focus on the words we say right before they move. We've already outlined that the stuff I talk about over here in the description and the stuff I talk about over here in the debrief is going to initially help me generate knowledge of what to do. Ultimately, though, this debrief is also going to help me synthesize knowledge of how to do it, which is the home of the cue. What we are going to come to find out is the language we use when describing what to do and articulating how to do it, it's not necessarily the same. Specifically recognizing that the knowledge of what to do, the language associated with this, which we're going to call technical or internal language, it has a home on the street. We're not kicking it out of your language locker. We're just simply saying it needs to be in this description or this debrief, leaving this cue to strictly be the home for what we're going to call external language and analogy-based language, both of which are the type of language that generate an insight that helps me know how to do something, not just more information about what I am doing. And so I say and emphasize this for a very simple reason. At no time am I going to tell you to get out your eraser and delete any of your language. Not going to happen. You might do that on your own. You definitely might start to think I need to say less. But ultimately, my goal here is to help you organize your language such that you say the right things at the right time to optimize that individual's understanding and application of your words. Now, if we're going to talk about what to say to drive how they move, the first thing that we might want to get just off the table as a topic is how many cues we should provide. Okay, and so here we could go into neuroscience, but I'm not going to do that to you. We're going to keep it very simple and straightforward with a story. So the story goes something like this. Einstein wanted to learn to golf. He got himself a golf coach. They go out to the range, and of course, bucket of balls, right? All the clubs, starts teaching Einstein how to hold the club, how to set up, how to tee up the ball, backswing, downswing, follow through. Pretty soon, Einstein is feeling overloaded. Says, stop. Walks over in what I imagine is a very intellectual walk over to the balls, grabs as many as he can, and as he tosses them at the instructor, says, catch. Now, obviously, all the balls come flying down. The instructor looks shocked, and Einstein says to him, just as you cannot catch all these balls, I cannot possibly think about everything you are saying. Give me one thing to focus on at a time. And so the moral of the story is this. Focus and attention is not the same thing as memory. You might be able to give someone 3 cues and they could remember or recall them. But in the moment under the bar, right, in the Olympic lift, up at bat, up on the mound, in those given moments, I can only put my attention, my spotlight on one thing at a time. And so you might have a cue for the down phase and the up phase of a squat. That's fine, as long as the athlete knows that. But when it comes to hunting down the right cue, we want to be building movement, one cue, one focus point at a time. You can cash that check at a bank, I promise you. And that is the one thing, if you do anything immediately, check yourself on 2 things. 1, am I ensuring the cue is happening right before the movement and it's not getting lost in my description? And then 2, am I only giving them one thing to think about? Because it's only through that process that then you can check whether or not that cue worked. If you give 2 or 3, just practically speaking, how are you going to follow back up and figure out what worked? Like a Rolodex, right? They're trying to flip through these cues as fast as they can because it is cognitively impossible for them to think about them consciously all at the same time. So this is a big area for coaching and movement professionals in general that we need to check ourselves. Once we recognize that we only want to give 1 cue at a time, we now have kind of that coaching communication loop. We know where it goes. The question then is, well, what type of cues should we be using? So to speak, what is the language that triggers someone's knowledge of how to do it versus just more insight on what they are doing? How do we get out of just giving descriptive language, as Rob Gray says, and actually embodying coaching language? And so we can think of this as a continuum of cues. This continuum of cues more or less outlines the different types of cues one could use when they are teaching virtually any movement. For a lot of my presentations, because I give them to various groups, I try to pick very fundamental movements we all can relate to. So again, we hear and see someone sprinting. Now, the way I want you to think about the language we use to coach movement, it lives on a scale of zoomed in to zoomed out, literal to figurative, okay? So zoomed all the way in like to a muscle or a joint, zoomed all the way out to an outcome. And the language can either be literal, referencing literal things in the environment, literal things in the body, or more figurative, like explode off the line like a jet taking off. And figurative language is the home of analogy, home of metaphor, right? So this kind of creates this continuum. And so if we look at our cues here, we see an example for each across 5 different, call it zoom levels on the camera. If I zoom all the way into the body, That's why we use the word internal, because it's inside the body. I start with a narrow internal cue. So extend your hips as explosively as you can. So narrow is either referencing one joint or one muscle. I can then zoom my lens out and start to reference a collection of joints and muscles. Instead of narrow, we call this broad. So drive your leg back as explosively as you can. This cue, as you might imagine, is less constraining. It's less limiting because I'm not asking you to think about just one micro unit of movement. But then, you might pause and say, well, hold on. When I move, when my athletes move, I'm not moving in a vacuum. I'm not moving in outer space with no physical context, gravity to interact with. So there's always something going on. And so in recognizing that, you might want to bring the reality back to the athlete. So you use a hybrid cue that references the environment they're working in. So drive your leg back, that's the internal part, into the ground. Oh, welcome environment to my cue. That's external to me, external ground, as explosively as you can. It's called a hybrid cue because it brings internal and external language together. And then finally, I can leave the perimeter of the body, recognizing that I am the one doing the movement. I am my coordination. Think about that, right? When I move, I am the movement. I'm not some bird's eye person with a controller controlling me. No, I am the thing moving. And so when you tell me drive the ground back as explosively as you can, in this context, I know it involves my leg. And so I can actually decrease the amount of information you have to think about, i.e. thinking about your leg, by just saying push the ground away. The body implicitly puts everything else together. We call that a close external cue because it's external from my body, obviously, but it involves me interacting with something close to me, in this case, the ground. In baseball terms, think of the ball and the bat and the glove primarily being our close external cues, right? In terms of referencing those from a movement perspective. And in the gym, usually the ground or the bar, the dumbbell, the medicine ball, that's going to be close to us, closer to the movement. But then I recognize I can zoom all the way out and say drive towards the finish as explosively as you can. In the case of baseball, that might be trajectory endpoint of ball, both in hitting it and in throwing it. In the gym, it might be driving the barbell towards the ceiling. Instead of focusing on the medicine ball, focusing on where I want the medicine ball to go, making the outcome stand out. We refer to that as being more salient in the mind. And so we literally have zoomed in and zoomed all the way out. And there's kind of this natural break point that happens at the hybrid where we leave the body and step into the environment. Now, for today's purposes, for time, I'm just going to primarily focus on these as literal external cues. But we also recognize I can also use analogy. So with my sprinter, explode off the line like a jet taking off, or gradually rise like a jet taking off. There's not literally a jet, nor am I a literal jet. However, because of the way our body schemas exist and interact with our visual memory, I can move as if. And so anytime you say it's kind of like or move as if, you're usually using figurative language. And so here's what we now know, that hybrid cues, close external, far external, and analogy language, those tend to be the categories of language and words that help someone develop knowledge of how to move, such that they're able to move better. And so what this means is we are going to want to start to move our internal technical language to our descriptions and our debriefs, leaving the cue to house external language and analogy-based language. Now, normally I can give a whole research spiel on this. On my YouTube channel, I have presentations that go through all the research, so I would point you to those. But I want to give you the high-level elevator pitch on this. And that is presently there are easily over 225 papers that are looking at the difference chiefly between internal and external. To my knowledge, no one has broken it down into this kind of continuum. And if we look at those papers, there's greater than 90% alignment by my estimates, showing that external language and analogy-based language, when it's a good cue, and it's the right cue, meaning it's addressing the right thing that they need to improve, are going to outperform internal language. Now, is that to say that people don't get better with internal language? Well, sure they do. Language isn't the only thing involved in helping you learn. If you do anything long enough, you will get better at it. independently of what you think. But if you want to optimize movement performance, and notably optimize the learning of that movement performance, the evidence is undeniable, mountains of it, with incredible agreement, pointing you towards external language and analogies being the home of the cue, right? Being the home of the last thing you say before they move, and so to speak, the address in their mind guiding how that movement is formed. I would encourage you to go deeper beyond my own resources, Gabrielle Wolf and her book, Attention and Motor Skill Learning. I think you can see me. So that's the book there, Attention and Motor Skill Learning by Dr. Gabrielle Wolf. For those of you that want the more research narrative, pick those resources up. They will absolutely defend everything I'm sharing with you today. And so then that leaves us here with that hybrid close external, far external, and analogy being the source of insight you want to plug into that cueing section. Now, we get to this point, and rarely do I have people say, well, that betrays my intuitions. If we all think about the language you use that work, especially for dynamic movements, especially for more sport-specific movements, we find that the language inevitably is more external, analogy-based, right? Sure, we all use internal language. What I'm encouraging you to do is figure out how you organize it better so that internal language doesn't distract, doesn't clog the mind. Because ultimately, if you tell someone just to think about their hips, but yet they're still sprinting, the hips are not the only thing involved when one sprints. And so that puts the challenge on them of thinking about their hips, thinking about sprinting, as well as the context they're sprinting in. And so the evidence is there. Internal cues cause paralysis by analysis, especially as the movement becomes more complex. And so that leaves us then in a position, well, how do we get richness out of our external cues? And that's the model I want to leave you with today, how we cue in 3D. And so this model is designed to help you generate better external cues, right? In the moment, if you would. This is mental software for coaching language that I'm hoping to impart on the world. And I call this the 3D cueing model because it involves 3 Ds, 3 components that work together to create optimized cueing, optimize words for your athlete. The first variable, right, that nets out as language in the cue is the distance the cue promotes. Meaning, am I focusing on something close to me or far away in the physical environment, right? So person, place, or thing, that means it's the noun inside of your cue. If your cue, at least when you're coming up with a new cue, right, brand new cue, if it doesn't reference the environment, you are disembodying this person. You are taking them out of the context they need to move in. So always anchor your cue into something in the physical environment. And by its distance to the person, that establishes whether it's close or far. But if I'm saying something like push the ground away in a sprint, that's a close distance, but hold on. Where am I moving in terms of that thing? And that's where the second D comes in. It's the direction. Well, am I moving away from the line? Am I moving towards the line? Is the bar moving away from the bench? Is it moving towards the ceiling? Right? These are all options that we can pivot from a language perspective. And so this, instead of it being a noun, this is the preposition, right? Away, towards, into, off of, to, through, so on and so forth. Now you might be thinking, well, how does something as simple as a preposition matter when it comes to learning movement? Well, let me give you an example. Imagine you're working with someone on sprinting. Imagine you are sprinting down a track, and I give you the following cues. First round, drive into the ground. Drive into the ground versus drive off of the ground. Drive off of the ground. Do those feel the same? Well, let's ask some questions. Which one feels more reactive? Off of. Which one feels more forceful? Into. Which one feels faster? Off of. Slower? Into. So pretty soon, when we start to look at our language, assuming we're giving them one clearly articulated cue at a time, it starts to have a massive impact on the way we move. So distance and direction define the space I'm moving in and have a consequence on how I move in that space. The third piece, though, is the action itself, the dynamics of the movement. How fast am I moving versus how slow? And so we have a type of language that we use, right, that articulates movement in words. We call that verbs. It's action language. They literally are little labels for movement patterns. And so when we bring that final verb into the mix, it makes it very clear how I'm approaching this movement pattern. Again, my apologies for the cough. So with the verb, let me give you two different ones to show you how they're vastly different. Push versus punch. Which one's faster? Punch. Which one's arguably more controlling in a movement pattern? Push. Which one's more violent, more energetic? Punch. Right? We could do this all day long. And so when we use precise language, we are going to get precise movement. The language ultimately sheds the words and becomes the focus the person adopts. Get this, they're not focusing on your cue. They're focusing through your cue. Let's say it again. They're not focusing on the words, at least they shouldn't be. They're focusing through the cue. But when I just say things like keep your knees here, squeeze your glute, extend your hips, this is important insight to give me background, but it doesn't help me when I'm online actually doing the movement, bring it to life. If anything, it distracts my attention from the holistic movement in the environment I'm trying to engage with. But these 3 Ds allow you to bring about the most nuanced movement changes. When your internal cue stops working, when extend the hip stops working, you've hit cueing bedrock. Where do you go when extend your hip doesn't work? Whereas with an external cue, you will have infinite possibilities of cues you can generate. So to round us out here, giving you a couple examples of this coming to life. Focus on bursting out of the blocks. Bursting, that's your descriptor. Out of, that's your direction. Blocks, that's your distance. It's close to the body. So this phrase we can see hiding inside of it are our 3 ingredients. A bench press. Focus on smashing the dumbbells through the ceiling. Smashing is my descriptor. Dumbbells through, that's my direction. Ceiling, it's far away. That's my distance. Now imagine I can change this cue to bring down the potency. Focus on pushing the dumbbells toward the ceiling. It fundamentally means the same thing, but the way that movement is going to be brought to life, very, very different. And I'm going to give you one final recommendation. I know I'm banging on the 1 cue at a time. When I only use 1 cue, I can use inflection, energy, and tone in my voice to highlight the different features of the cue. Again, I'm going to struggle to bring that brightness to my language when I'm giving them 2 to 3. And so what we start to find then with this 3 Ds is it gives you something analogous to a language lock, such that you are trying to get to the words that work. You are trying to unlock the movement pattern. And so when you're trying to say, do I refine the cue, reiterate, or retire it, you need a process to help you do that. And that's exactly what the 3 Ds are there for. You know, I can change my verb, my descriptor. I can change my direction, toward versus away. I can change what they're anchoring their movement to. The band around the knees versus the ground versus the ceiling versus the barbell. Just as we showed earlier, attention cannot equally be paid to all of those. And through that debrief, in discussing the cues with them, even encouraging them to come up with their own cues, you can guide them towards the words that work, unlocking the movement for that individual in that moment. Now, how do you mechanize this? How do you mechanize this? Well, I'm going to give you a 3-step process, and then we'll close out because I know I'm coming to the end of my time here. So the first thing, let me recommend, is when you're coming up, when you're working with someone and you're working on a new movement error you're trying to overcome, start with all 3 Ds. I call this the complete cue. Right? I think you have a lecture later on around communication and how often we think that it's taken place, yet it hasn't. And this is why I say communication is not what is said, it is what is heard, understood, and applied. So if you want to increase the odds of your communication landing and sticking, start with all 3 Ds because it forms the base component to know how to move an environment. And so here I have a kettlebell swing, my baseline complete cue. At the bottom of the motion, reach the kettlebell at the wall behind you. Let's say I have a chat with the athlete. We don't really like that, so we refine it. And that refining is what I refer to as shift the Ds. Find a different combination on the lock to see if you can create greater potency. All right, so here I make some small changes. The bottom of the motion, push the kettlebell into the wall behind you. And then maybe I do it once more. At the end of the motion, stretch the bottom of the bell away from your shirt collar. Once you become aware of these three variables, the amount of language available to you to simply nudge and refine the cues until you get those eyes wide light bulb reps coming out by design, by choice over chance, you will start to see why I'm personally so passionate about this. Our athletes are the ones that are going to thank us for making the change. Finally, then, we want to consolidate our cue. We want to decrease cognitive pollution by getting these idea into the least amount of words possible. So I take my baseline cue, but inevitably I realize I don't need to tell them at the bottom of the motion. They know that. I don't need to reference the kettlebell anymore. They know they have one. So I might just say push to the wall, or simply push or wall. And these little taglines, these mantras, are derived from training. And from a baseball perspective, they actually should generate the ideas and the thoughts when they're hitting, when they're pitching, when they're fielding, when they're playing the game. Sports psychology shouldn't be this extracurricular activity. It's not. It happens in the context of learning these movements. And so this is spot on to building the mental ecosystem that can bring these movements to life when they are under pressure. Now, in final, how does it all look? I'd like to give one example. So I'm just going to take an extra 2 to 3 minutes here, and then I'll give you my final quote, and I will sign off. So in my book, again, I excuse the promotion there, but in my book, I outline 27 different cueing grids, right? 27 different movements. And what I wanted to do is give you a sample of what those cueing grids look like today. So here, keeping with our theme of sprinting, I have the sprinting cueing grid. You can see here it's focusing on the cue it and do it portion of the physical movement. Now, I'm not saying this is the only way to approach this, but when it comes to cueing, we like to organize our language around the major coachable features of the movement. So for me, we have 3 dynamic features and 1 static feature when it comes to sprinting. Posture is the static feature. Leg action pushing back, that's dynamic 1. Leg action punching forward, dynamic 2. Arm action, dynamic 3. Recognizing that all this happens simultaneously, we are trying to find the category of cue, which is to say the meaning I want to impart that we believe is the deficit. It's the blind spot, so to speak, in their mind. And so let's say I find this in team sport athletes quite a bit. They're lacking the punch. They're not bringing the leg forward. They're not lifting the hammer high enough to hit the nail. So I might say punch through the air, or drive toward the finish, or punch through the finish, or get away from the ground. I might even bring an analogy in, which I'll show here in a second. Drive your knee forward as if to shatter a pane of glass. And so to mechanize our cues, you can start to build these grids out, sharing them amongst your team. Not to say you can't riff beyond this, but this is a great way to start to instantiate and download the software that I'm trying to share tonight, in this case being the 3D cueing model. The other piece, which I would love to come back and present in the future, because I think it's remarkably relevant in baseball and in the sport of baseball in particular, is this idea of using tape on the body, just normal strapping tape, as we would say here in Ireland. And so again, we can see that it's broken down by the section of the movement I'm seeking to change. Here, let me just give you one for posture so you see its application. If you have someone that's flexed all the time when they're trying to sprint, and you know it's shutting down hip flexion and force production, and you want to see them open up, well, what do? You take a piece of tape, you put it on their upper back, a literal piece of tape on their lower back, just on their shirt. You ask them the following questions. Show me what you're doing if the pieces of tape are getting farther away, and they'll kind of flex to pull them apart. Good. Show me what you're doing if the tape's getting closer together. They're going to extend to bring them together. And then I give them a simple cue. Smash the tape together when you drive off the line. And so it is yet to fail. It takes this complex movement, puts it into an attentional focus that's easy to navigate, and it allows these 2 little spots to bring the whole movement together. So when you're struggling to come up with an external cue, I use this cue tape system to bring the nuance into the movement patterns, something I would encourage you to take a look at. And then finally, we didn't get into it today, but starting to bring analogies to life, the ability to use this figurative visual language, something to think about. It's not just for kids, but for a future day. So in final now, true final, cues are this vehicle we can use to navigate, to help the athlete navigate the terrain of the mind in hopes that they will arrive at the desired movement destination. My hope is today you learned how to organize that language and specifically highlighting the cue, recognizing it's not just about what they know, it's about their ability to know how to apply it. So everything I talked about today is based on my book, which is now available. I have a number of online courses completely free on YouTube. You can access them all at thelanguageofcoaching.com. Much more research presentations in there if you'd like. Any questions, as Frank said, info@thelanguageofcoaching.com. I'm the one that's answering those. And then if you want the fresh ideas, it's at Nick Winkelman. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Nick, outstanding job, man. Yeah, the hopper. Let's see. Any questions, guys? Let's Nick, question here.
Yeah, go for it.
Would you use internal cueing to maximize specific muscle recruitment? For example, the cars.
Yep. So if you are specifically targeting EMG, right? You want a specific group of muscles to be activating, and that is prime. That, let's say, supersedes any kind of dynamic movement. Then yeah, there is emerging evidence out there, Frank, that internal cues cause the muscle to activate more. But it's almost in the spirit, you know, how they used to say muscle confusion, and that it's like this inefficient drive to just the area that you are referencing. And so if I want glute activation, if I want posterior cuff activation, and I'm giving tactical cues as well, I think internal language in those scenarios, based on the evidence, would be indicated. Where it becomes contraindicated is the second coordination, the second motion, control of motion, and quality of motion becomes primary for you. And that's the pivot point. And this is where, especially in baseball, and Rob Gray, who I'm sure you're familiar with, Rob Gray has done some amazing work on this. He has shown that when athletes are injured, they tend to already go internal, even once they've recovered. He's shown this in pitchers as well as hitters. But then we also know, when we look at the language common to the physical therapy space and strength and conditioning, if you were to look at a percentage split, we're probably using 60 to 70 to 40 to 30 internal language to external. So now we have someone who's already internal because they're injured. We now likely have professionals that are given a lot of internal cues, possibly asking them a lot of questions. How's your knee? How's your shoulder? And so we're flooding the mind with attentional cues that are toxic, that ultimately are going to keep them focusing on the part. And do you know what suffers? The whole, the return to full coordination and the confidence we want around it. So that's for a different day, but you have to be very clear when you draw the line in the sand around when you use internal language, in my opinion.
Very good. Next question. Nick, how much external feedback should you provide without developing dependency? For example, exit velocity, Kaiser output numbers, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, people they've attempted for decades now to pinpoint a number on this, Frank. And so let me try to put a little bit of texture around it. I do think a lot of this is going to come down to the art of coaching and how that individual responds. Some people can develop dependency with a minimal amount of information. Other people, right, might get tons of information and never develop a dependency. And so in my experience, there's no hard and fast rule. But what they used to show is, you know, when you were given feedback, you know, 3 out of 4, 4 out of 4 reps, right? So 75 to 100% of the time, there was this idea that there's feedback dependency. They showed that feedback dependency went away when you were giving cues or feedback information to the athlete 33 to 50% of the time. So if you think about giving information every other or every third, that's the closest thing that I have to a hard and fast rule. But for me, if I'm honest, I use something called fading feedback. If I was working with you on a movement and we're trying to figure it out collaboratively. And let's say I'm working with you on some sprinting. I might be giving you cues every single repetition till we figure out the one that works. Once we figure out the one that works, then I'm going to back way off. I might not give you one for 5 reps, or it might be every other rep. And so what I'm encouraging people to do is, once you've identified a feedback source that works, whether it's a cue that they can remember on their own or some kind of natural feedback in the environment, remove yourself until you see that that source of feedback is no longer helping them. Now, specific to baseball, if we're talking about all the technology that they can avail of, I would use it in a very similar way. I would maybe early on use the feedback as much as I think I need to get an understanding of what needs to change and articulate that to the player. But once that change starts to emerge, I'm going to see how many reps can I remove that feedback from and still keep that result. I think ultimately that needs to be a decision between the sports scientist or your analyst, your sport coach, strength coach, and the player. But as long as you're pursuing less, that's my punchline. Pursue less so that the athlete can own more. That's best practice. I can't hear you, Frank. You're muted, buddy.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You know, being in baseball where you started, you know, the language barriers with players from Latin America, now players from the Far East and other countries, and even now where you sit in Europe, the language barrier in general, you know, how long do you give yourself to develop this art of cueing?
And you're talking about working with players where you don't speak each other's language. And so yes. That was exactly the case when I was with the Pirates. I mean, I learned Spanish in about 12 weeks, you know, in about 30 days, actually, I learned enough Spanish to be able to actually coach. And so one is there's obviously learning to coach in their language, but you and I both know that's going to be limited to the degree you can apply what we talked about today. And so if we step back, what are we trying to do? We're trying to educate attention. We're trying to get them to think about things in a way that improves the way they move. There's nothing that says that has to come through words, nothing. And so even in the last little imagery I showed you, what I'm seeing a lot more coaches do, and I'd like to think I've tried to influence this, is using imagery. You know, even putting together a couple slide decks that you can then laminate yourself to show pictures of visual cues. Do you have a whiteboard that you can draw on? Are you able to demonstrate yourself? Better use of video, showing them that video and saying, and pointing, no verbal required. The final thing, Frank, that I use all the time, I used it when I was with the Pirates, I used it when I've coached in China, is what I call the A-B demonstration or the 1-2 demonstration. And so I'll get everyone's attention. However, I'll be like 1, and let's say I show a squat movement, looks horrible. 1, and I say 2, dos, 2, and I show it now perfect, the way I want it. And then I ask the question, 1 or 2, uno, dos. And all of a sudden, everyone's telling you the exact number. That's the movement we want to see. And I say exactly. So those A-B demonstrations are a brilliant way to involve them, ask a question, and you're delivering the same visual insight that normally would come through your words.
That's a great nugget, man. Awesome. Okay, the last question live here. Nick, when doing a debrief, how much of it should be athlete driven? For example, what did you feel? As opposed to how much should be coach driven? Like, here's what I saw.
Yep. That is just a brilliant question. And so some of it depends on how much time you have, right? If you're doing a bullpen, someone might have a lot of time. If you're working with a rehab player, you might have a lot of time. If you're in a group context, you might have 30 seconds. So people just need to think about how much time they have available. But the key thing is it always should be both. But the more experience the athlete has, the more they should be the one doing the talking. So if I'm working with a newbie that's never done this movement before, it might be 30-70 on-air mic time between the athlete and me. But if I'm working with an elite professional, right, it might be 70 them, 30 me, because I'm asking questions, I'm getting them involved. I'm trying to get that to that precise understanding, that precise blockage, and see if I can have them. Can you help me help you? In the words of Jerry Maguire, right? Can we actually create that understanding? Because ultimately, Frank, what do we know? It's not the words that make sense to me. It's the words that make sense to you. And if I don't get them talking, I cannot possibly understand how to synthesize language that works for them.
Beautiful. Awesome stuff, man. There's still a couple of questions, Nick. I hope you can hang on and answer those in the hopper. I think you have access to do that. But no.
Q&A section. Yeah. I'll answer those.
Okay. Thanks for taking the time. It's been great seeing you. And again, quality content. Good stuff, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all.
Take care. God bless and happy holidays to you.
Thank you. Likewise.